Welcome back to the Trending Communicator. I'm your host, Dan Nestle. I've always thought of myself as an embracer. I embrace. New food, I embrace it. New gadgets, embrace it. New tech, absolutely embrace it. But if I'm being honest, I haven't been as embracing as I've puffed myself up to be. I mean, I have a podcast, so why aren't I doing video? And I'm all over AI, but why am I simply paying lip service to voice chat? Maybe it's because I've always been a snob for the written word, or maybe it's because I'm having trouble figuring out if voice will be additive to what I do. And it's hard to conceptualize how I could connect voice with everything else I do. Now, I will say I've begun to dabble, and voice chat, let's call it a part of conversational AI, is far superior than what I had imagined. And I'm glad I didn't try it out 6 months or a year ago. So much so that now I'm ready to dive in and learn all about it. So lucky for me and for all of us, I've met today's guests a few months ago and have been dying to have them on the show because they've been all in on conversational AI since the BC, before ChatGPT days. Together, they found and run Pragmatic Digital, a strategic marketing agency that helps small and medium businesses leverage cutting-edge technology for tangible business results. They're doing what I aspire to do. They're making AI accessible and practical for their customers, guiding them toward a demystified and productive AI-assisted future. They're strategists, they're technologists, teachers, public speakers, authors of Voice Strategy, Creating Useful and Usable Voice Experiences, and more recently, Voice Marketing, Harnessing the Power of Conversational AI to Drive Customer Engagement. It's both a pleasure and an honor to have them on the show. And I keep saying them because clearly it's more than one person. The AI power couple themselves in the flesh, Susan and Scot Westwater.
Hello.
Guys, how are you?
Thanks for having us. Great.
Good.
It is good to see you. And, for our listeners' benefit, we met at MACON, the Marketing AI conference back in September, I guess it was, in beautiful Cleveland, Ohio, which was beautiful those days, actually, in September. And I have to say, that was my first exposure to this world of, people who are making their living with or appended to generative AI and AI in general, and I didn't know what to expect because, I had recently left the corporate world and been really getting into AI. But now that I'm on my own, I'm looking for my peers and people that I really connect with. And, I think that it was an amazing conference. Hats off to Paul Reitzer and Mike Caput and Catherine and everybody there. But finding your tribe, finding the people that you really kind of holy crap, I can learn a lot from these folks and, potentially partner with. And, boy, oh boy, what a positive multiplier of my understanding this is going to be. Susan and Scot are among those people and those, that I met that I feel that way about. And a little quick shout out to Dave Armano, who told me to look out for Scot and Susan. I mean, it's a big community, but a tight-knit one at the same time. That's too much preamble. I just want to just thank you really for being here. And, let's just start off by hey, who are you guys? And, I called you the power couple of AI because, for a couple of reasons. First of all, I think it's true. Second of all, you're the only couple, married couple doing this that I know. But how did this all happen? You have a long career from various directions, and you decided to go all in on this stuff, prior to it being du jour or whatever it is. So what's the story?
I guess I'll go first.
Go ahead, Susan, you go first. Yeah.
Because, the story is very different for the two of us, which is kind of the fun thing. And that's one of the things I do like to point out that we're still married after doing this for 7 years now, or 8 years now, I think.
8 years, yeah.
Because, if you'd have told me that I was going to get married, have a family, and work with my spouse and found a company, probably would have told you that was completely the wrong person who you were doing the reading for. But here we are. Essentially, we both came from a career of, my career actually is started traditional, if we call it that anymore. If there's BC, I guess it's downright prehistoric of pre-web. And being a college student who lucked into working at a small agency, promotional marketing, advertising, and going down this path. I had this delusion of grandeur I'd be a creative. And I say delusion because after I met some incredible professionals, copywriters, I learned that coming up with 5 headlines about cocoa mix that didn't sound completely horrible was impressive. Like, I was sort of
hard.
like, I can write
It's
plays,
hard
I can do a lot of things. Obviously I can write books. That is not something I can do. So I quickly had to say, all right, well, now what do I want to be when I grow up? So I went down this wonderful path of working with some incredible mentors and just working my way up through essentially going along this whole path of learning about proper marketing, brand strategy, promotions, all of those things. And then when digital happened, being like, this is interesting. Let me keep doing this. So I would say it's been a story of just curiosity and research and resourcefulness that have come through. I then got the opportunity over time. You kind of start to say, all right, what else is beyond there? I actually went to the corporate side for a while and really doubled down on content strategy, headed up a content team, learned all the fun things about practicing in corporate as opposed to agency side, where, quite frankly, I think we're kind of pirates at times getting to do those things. But seeing all of these things work. Now, the funny thing is my love of voice actually comes from, and this is where I know I'm precocious, but this is where my double English major shows up, is one of the most, I'm a few credits short of being a medievalist. And I always keep needing to I always want to go back, but what I studied very much for was in Renaissance Florence, vernacular, and along those things. Now, one of the interesting things about during that time is we always think about the art, but we don't think about the writing and the language. We went from a time of where basically spoken word was the only way of news because only the elites knew how to read, especially. And then once the printing press happened, still it was for the elites. It was in Latin. And one of my most favorite books, and I cringe when I say it, but it's the truth. My favorite books is The Divine Comedy because it is in vernacular. It's one of the first printed. There's a million reasons why. I mean, having been in Florence and seeing where, the launching of 1,000 ships and all that nerdiness, I won't bore anyone with any more of that. The whole thing of it was, though, it was amazing to see this trend of where we were in a digital world where everything was still in one language. It was literacy, there's accessibility, all of those things. As we started to see this trend all the way back in 2017, even with Alexa and even with Google, the Google Assistant and things, spoken word suddenly became this way of being able to transfer information in a much more democratic method. You didn't have to be able to read. There were opportunities to put things in language. It was starting to get back to the roots again of how information was kind of pulling down some of the gatekeeping. And I really geeked out about that, of how we do that flow of written and spoken. And then also the whole idea of the nuances, which I'm sure we'll talk about today, of what happens when your brand starts speaking, when your brand actually has to have a real personality, not just a really neat thing that's in a SharePoint drive somewhere. These were all really interesting, rich experiences that come into play, which is what really geeked me out. Now, Scott was a lot. I would say I was more of the heart and emotion of the possible. I would say Scott was much more of the rational, not to put too.
Well, I mean, my background is in visual design and user experience. So back around 2015, 2016, a lot of people are talking about Amazon Alexa, Google Assistant, Siri. I started doing research and started digging into how people are actually interacting with these devices because, as Sue mentioned, like, our careers predate the web. So we saw the advent of the web and trying to convince brands that the internet wasn't a fad. As a matter of fact, I worked with David Armano at one point and had a creative director tell me, focus on print. That's going to be your bread and butter. This internet thing's a fad. Granted, 20 years ago, the world was a very, very different place. But, kind of seeing that trend and embracing the technology, we went through this like 3 times in our career between the web and then social and then mobile. So here was this other moment where it was like yeah, this definitely seems like something that people are going to adopt more and more. It reduces friction. It removes literacy out of the equation. You don't have to know how to use a computer. Literally, as long as you can ask a question, you can get some sort of response. So that's when we really started focusing in on, all right, what is conversational AI? How can it actually help solve real business challenges? Whether it's marketing or comms or, customer support and service, sales. There's a lot of different applications of the technology. And the other thing that people tend to forget is chatbots are part of conversational, voice assistants are part of it, voice mode and ChatGPT. They're all like different flavors of it. You're physically using your voice to ask a question and getting some sort of response from a system. So we just saw it as a force multiplier and making it easier for people to access information, not only internally within an organization, but language support and being able to have content in multiple languages is now a possibility. 5-7 years ago, it was almost impossible unless you had unlimited budget. So from an accessibility standpoint, it makes a lot of sense. From a doing the right thing standpoint, it makes a lot of sense. And from a business standpoint, it makes a lot of sense.
Oh, for sure. And just hearing the litany of the kind of high level uses that you've just talked about, and and I've been there with you. Like I understand, like I've gone through the same transitions, the same process, a little closer to Sue, I think, because I started off in a kind of getting into copywriting, and then went in from there into corporate, and had a long corporate career in PR, comms, and marketing, a lot of B2B stuff for many years, and then kind of wound my way around the world and back into agency, then back into corporate. You know how it goes, right?
Yeah.
But the whole time, just kind of looking at these transitional or revolutionary technologies and dealing with that. Something I think, by the way, that anybody who's not Gen X and maybe boomers, I suppose, although debatable, but anybody who's not really Gen X or very, very, very early millennials, I mean, they're never going to experience anything like this, like these kinds of, like, why don't you get super excited about this transition? Well, I've seen it before, This time I'm really excited though about AI. But really what I wanted to ask you though is like you kind of lead into my first like big question, because I think folks think conversational AI, oh yeah, that's Alexa, that's Siri. And now of course with voice on ChatGPT, I don't know how many people are taking advantage of that, but can you just lay out like the conversational AI ecosystem? What does that look like? And what are the areas that we should be looking at, in our world as creators, communicators, and marketers?
Well, there is Amazon Alexa, Google Assistant, is still there. Samsung has Bixby. You've got Siri from Apple. So those are like the known entities. But I think the bigger opportunity most people don't think about right now is voice enabling your mobile app. And so that is actually a fairly, well, depending on what you're trying to do, I will couch it with that. But depending on what you're trying to do, it can be a fairly easy lift to add to your existing infrastructure. There are platforms that exist that allow you to add almost like a voice mode on top. And the idea there is you don't have to worry about navigation. You don't have to worry about knowing where in the app a certain feature or, if you're trying to do tracking or whatever it is, you can literally just speak it into existence. So that's a huge untapped area that we have seen some brands having success in. Having virtual avatars where it's like a virtual influencer where you've got their likeness, you've got their voice, and being able to interact. So you could do that from an influencer standpoint, but also from a customer service and support standpoint. There's a lot of those types of applications that people aren't necessarily thinking about either. But, Susan's been involved. I was initially involved, but Susan's been heavily involved the past couple of years in some consumer research. And so we have data that shows how people are using like Amazon Alexa, for instance, and the types of things that they're looking for, what they want to be able to do in the future, and kind of start to look at a lot of the potential use cases. And I will do a little spoiler alert. It's not too dissimilar from what they're trying to do in other channels. They just see voice as an easier mode in a lot of cases. And so they want to continue with it. But
Yeah. Yeah. And I think that's definitely with the ecosystem. You just actually sparked a thought about what we're seeing in the AI world. And it's actually this funky time of where we actually created a diagram once of it, although I will have to dust it off because it's a year old. And I feel like anything over 6 months at this point is dated.
Yeah.
It's the whole idea of voice as a product. So that is your Alexa skills. That's your Alexa games, all those novelties, those things where you can monetize it right then and there. And then we have this whole idea of voice as part of a brand experience or conversational AI as we think about that. And that whole thought of here's how I can use it to answer questions easily at any time. Here's how I can be able to plus up how someone's unboxing. I can enhance an experience. I can give accessibility to celebrities or my own brand spokesperson or spokes icon. Any of those things, these are all ways that we can make it so that you can that whole idea of reach out and touch someone, you can actually reach out and talk to them. Yep. And that creates an incredibly rich experience when we think about customer experience, especially when we think of, it's 5 years ago now, almost to the day, in a couple months, we went from being able to do stuff at shelf. We've been able to do stuff in store, on premise. That all disappeared. Well, then what happens? How do I build that brand? And what's really kind of interesting about voice is a moment where to engage with it, you have to initiate it. It's not disruption, it's invited.
Yep.
And it gives us this opportunity to have that conversation if we do well. If we don't do it well, then it's monologues and it's annoying and people just shut it off. But there are ways of having that back and forth and engagement that actually allows for this very rich experience where then we do win a heart, not just... And we kind of move from the whole idea of I'm not just a provider, I'm an advisor, or I'm that expert, or I'm that guide, or whomever I'm supposed to be, who I want that personality to be, which is why we have to be intentional then, by the way, about who it is we want our audiences to speak with. And that can work from a B2B perspective just as much as it can work from an external customer engagement perspective, because we're able to kind of cover off on these two things. And while, yes, these products are really cool, and I think about all of the AI building that's happening around us, the one thing that I always want to tell people is I am not asking you when you start working with us that you're going to have to learn how to build these things. That's why you're hiring experts, right? That's why you need, quite frankly, if you knew how to do it yourself, you probably wouldn't be calling me. You'd be reading our books. That's what I like to think anyhow. But the reality of it is we're thinking, how do we make this an easier way to engage? How do we make it so that we're covering off on the important parts, and then how we make that happen? Because these things all have to be consistent, because just as no one, we learn this through the web and social and all of those things. And by the way, social is another place where conversational happens. They're conversational experiences. Sometimes it's a back and forth. Sometimes it's through the bot. But they're all things that are happening in front of everyone. It's just a public conversation as opposed to the one-on-ones. All of those things happen. We have to think about being consistent then. And is that the same person, or same personality and those particular things?
Yeah. The idea of assigning personality to a bot, right? To essentially, your voice, your interlocutor in whatever, I guess, medium that you're choosing. It's hard enough to choose a logo or I don't know how many discussions you guys have been in where it's like, you're trying to pick that, what do they call it? The animated logo or the sound logo for a company that goes at the beginning of your video. It's like literally 1.5 seconds long, and you hear 40 different versions of dissonant chimes, and you're like, 36, there's no science in it, but it has to represent the brand in some way. With voice, I think it's in some ways probably a lot harder to kind of get that mascot or that avatar decided on. Maybe it depends on the size of the company and however many fingers they have and however many pies. But I can just hear the discussions in the PR, in the weekly PR meeting, which is like, well, we have a new voice avatar, but he or she needs to sound less masculine, more feminine, or needs to be needs to sound vaguely Singaporean, or something. something like this. So, I guess the good news is that you can make that happen, but to decide that is a effort.
Well, the good thing is we have in our back pocket. I mean, I used to work on commercials. So like casting voice talent for specific spots, like is just something you do as part of that process, right? Well, that is still relatively new to the AI space. So there's, kind of going back to the way we used to do stuff and basically coach the voice talent and say, I need it to be performed this way. Now you can either take an actual human actor or actress and digitize their voice, or you can actually create a synthetic voice that's wholly ownable and just kind of a standalone. But to your earlier point, like voice and tone now become literal. Like, is it an American accent? Is it British? Is it Australian? Is it male? Is it female? Is it urban, suburban? Like all of these things are now part of the consideration set, which ultimately needs to ladder back to your brand attributes, and what you stand for.
Yeah. And the interesting thing is that gets to be you have to be, my favorite, I guess my word of the year is going to be intentional, of where folks are kind of like, oh, I didn't think about that. And we've done enough of this that we know what questions to ask to start thinking about it, because it does become those things of when you think about what is it when you react to a person, like, what is this relationship to begin with? Am I the expert that you're going to? Am I a servant? Are these all these different things? Or am I a colleague, or am I that friend? And, for one particular brand that we were working with, it was, is this that know-it-all friend who does everything better than you can? Is that who we're talking about? Or is that too off-putting? Who do we want that to be? And other times it is like when we talk about gender, and there's been so much studying that's already been done on all of this. I actually had a presentation a couple years back from someone who was working on how do we create a non-binary voice, taking the best aspects of male voices and the best aspects of female voices. And by best, I mean the things that resonate, the things we hear. Because when you start going down the path of why people react to voice, we have evolutionary things such as we are descended from the person, that being that said, when mom said, get back in the house or get back in the cave because the saber-toothed tiger is coming, we're programmed to hear our mother's voice. We're programmed to hear all these things that we've heard. So how do we lean into it? Do we lean away from it? What do we do? It was interesting because when they did that study, the preferences still came forward and said, what was shared was like, we still haven't figured that out yet. So it is then when we say, all right, is it a male and a female? Do we think of teams? Do we think of things that way? And that's actually where one of our co-authors, who I've done quite a bit of work with, and Scott has as well, of sonic branding and audio branding, it goes beyond the jingle. It goes into where we start to get into the fun world of HCI and audio cues but there's a moment where we can be intentional about those noises and those sounds and triggers, just as much as like Apple was thinking about it. The first, when you restart, it's an upward note. The same thing, the same things apply when you start thinking about it. You can get really geeked out. Oh, for sure. To be quite honest, it's also where you get to be creative again. We have all of this science and technology. This is where we kind of get into the art of it, which I find really fun.
Yeah.
And having those conversations.
It just keeps like layer after layer is peeling away in my head as you speak. There's this whole front end where somebody's interacting with the voice. So that how that interaction happens, that basically dictates the immediacy of the experience, and that dictates the intentionality of a lot of things, right?
Yep.
But fundamentally, right, the conversation, the voice AI part of it is still the LLM, right? Or whatever language model is powering it. Is that right? Is that a good way to think about it?
It's a piece of it.
Yeah.
It's a piece of it.
So the way we used to traditionally do it is we would have to map out intents and literally say, if someone says this is what they mean, and here's all the synonyms that go along with it, and here's our response to it. So where LLMs come in is they're really good at matching language and intent. So we don't actually have to do that as much. But really, we're relying very heavily on natural language processing, even more so than LLMs. So there may be an LLM component of it, but it's not the primary driver of the experience. There's also like the concept of RAG within generative AI also applies on the conversational side.
Retrieval augmented generation or
generation, yeah. So
Sorry.
having
Had a flex a little
that's
there.
good.
yeah.
No, I
that's
like
awesome.
no, that's good because let's be honest, acronyms and abbreviations are the devil because it can mean so many different things.
Yeah.
But it's a fancy way of saying a knowledge base. So
Yeah.
uploading your own information, whether it's something as simple as a Google Doc, something as complex as an actual database, but ultimately it's your information, your proprietary information that's not part of the larger model. And that's actually going to likely be where a lot of that content and a lot of that information is being powered from. So that's kind of how we've moved, even 4 or 5 years ago into adopting generative AI.
Yeah.
But it's really helped make the process of creation a lot more efficient.
So it's like you're creating small language models in a sense.
In fact, that's a great way to look at it.
It's a great way to look at it.
Mm-hmm. I've been I'm making no bones or no secrets about this, but I'm crazy about Notebook LM, right? Just nuts about it. And we can get to the voice part of that later if we'd like, because I do have questions. But that the idea of creating your own knowledge base in a single instance that is basically the sole source of what the AI is essentially allowed to talk about or give you. Is that the same way to think about a voice system? And maybe it would be easier to kind of narrow it down to a practical example. Like, so recently it's different people have been coming up on my radar. And I spoke to a company that does conversational AI for outbound sales. Right now, that's new because as you said earlier, Susan, voice is invited typically, right? But this is actually going out there and somewhat being it's opt-in and all that stuff. But if you really want to get down to it, it's outbound.
Yep.
It's a push. So it's crossing that barrier. So I was asking him, well, how do you regulate what the AI, like how that conversation goes? And he was just explaining that it's already quite narrowed down by the nature of the funnel and the task and the sales thing. And the AI knows because, the system prompt, as it were, just says, if you veer off of this conversation, you bring it right back to this, to say XYZ. So with the capability of that happening, that's, or with that kind of way that we can use the technology, it seems like now it's really taking off. And, I was really just curious about it's not as simple as, okay, I have an LLM, I could just plop voice into it, right?
Yeah, please don't.
Okay, good. That's what
yeah, I mean, because you started talking about those intentional things of what are we going to talk about? What don't we talk about? But most conversations, even like here, is, unscripted conversation, right? They're not linear. And so even before LLMs and those things, so we used to have to think about how can this conversation go off? And from a UX perspective, we talk about the happy path, right? Which is the fastest path. All things go right. We go happily to where they need to go. We spend in conversational design, probably 80% of the time not planning for the happy path, because that's easy. It's how do I get someone back to where they want to? How do I guide them without A, being forceful and a jerk, B, getting them without irritating the crap out of them because I've asked them 13 times to clarify.
Yeah.
How do we do that as you would as in a conversation with someone? The people you like talking to or those types of interviews. And then also, how do we, when something comes up that we don't want to talk about, or if there's something that's inappropriate, and there's two sides of that. There's off task, right?
Yeah.
And it's just, no, we'll get back to that, or how have you. But then there's also that is completely inappropriate. How do I handle that conversation for someone? Because I think that is the one nature of these bots. People say things to robots that you would never, ever in a billion years even fathom saying to a human.
For sure.
And it can sound like a human. They're still going to talk to it in a way that's a bit different. So how do we set those boundaries? But also, how do we make sure that whatever it is we really want them to know or they need to know, we're still getting to that, and that derailing. So those are those important things. And you still have to think about that.
Yep.
You still have to put those guardrails in. You still have to put that into the logic. So you may have your whole corpus of information in your knowledge base, but then it's sort of here are the guardrails of where that talks to. What's helpful when we start talking about those LLMs is it gives us a broader depth and breadth of understanding what someone's even asking.
Mhm.
So instead of having to hard code, if a great example is one of our partners we were building a skill for, their company's name is CZM Son. It is a French name. It gets butchered a lot.
Mhm.
And how do I get that to work? So it was, CZM, and going through and figuring out every horrible way someone could pronounce it. It's 6EM or all these other things. Then figuring out, then after we saw it launched, of looking back and saying, oh gosh, I didn't even think someone would call it that. All right, let's make sure that it understands what we're talking about. Those are kind of some of the fine tuning, and that's a very simplified example. Just for anyone thinking, oh, that sounds easy. Yeah, it gets a little more complex. But the point of it is thinking through each of those bits. That's where LLMs make our lives a little bit easier, because some of that logic happens a bit more easily.
Yeah.
Oh, you mean this, because contextually it's that, as opposed to having to say, no, specifically, if you hear this phonetically spelled, this is how this works, or things like that.
Yeah.
And that's just one side of it. But
Well, and the other part of like the sales conversation is it doesn't have to be an outbound. So like we've done some work with home healthcare companies, and I think it's less than 20% of inbound requests actually get a response. So whether it's email or calling in, most organizations aren't responding. So if you had almost like an autoresponder that as soon as someone submitted a form, would call them up and answer basic questions and then try to schedule an appointment.
Yeah.
Like that's going to go a long way to, helping move that prospect from informational to at least consideration, if not purchase. But it's those types of things that you can implement where it doesn't even have to proactively go out and find people on your behalf, just simply responding to people that are already hitting your website and giving them value immediately. There's technology now that enables that. So
it's that inbound case is the first one that I heard about. You're like the outbound is like later. That's why I'm like, oh, you can do that now, because I'd already heard about, makes sense that there's just frontline customer service, scheduling, scheduling appointments. There's a great company doing work with auto dealerships and called Stella AI. They do like repair appointment, like appointment scheduling and service appointments and things like this. And, it's essentially, you're only limited by how many phone lines you have, essentially, and by how much bandwidth you have on the phone line in terms of how many calls can happen at once. And nobody's hitting the busy signals, or nobody's getting the voicemail, and all that's wonderful from an experience standpoint. Right.
Yep.
But thinking about the real, like kind of that next level interaction, right? These are the baby steps, that next level interaction where you develop a conversational solution, or a conversational, team member, or a conversational phone person, whatever it is, that is actually going to have deeper interaction on a broader, more, I guess, a less, a more general topic, or more significant problems. It's going to discuss more significant problems with the other person. I was just thinking about first of all, how many guardrails and guidelines. Let's not even mention the ethics, because ethical AI is certainly an issue with everyone. But all of that has to be included. But add on top of that, I could see again, going back to that PR meeting, that weekly PR meeting, I could see the comms people sitting there with hair on fire saying, all right, we're going to let loose a conversational AI to talk to somebody. And if somebody doesn't know, what if they don't know it's AI? And then they say something that is either offensive or mispronounced, or maybe the other person just simply mishears something,
or it goes ahead and offers a bereavement fare that doesn't exist for Air Canada. I mean, that's an actual case
exactly.
that happens, right?
That would never happen. Like something like this.
Yeah.
So the trepidation, the reluctance to sort of embrace this full on, I guess it has to do with technological advancement and same thing with everything else with compliance. But, for the PR world and the comms world, and for marketers who deal with, especially in the B2B space where it's far more relationship focused, right? It just, there has to be a simultaneous maybe way, and maybe you can help me understand this, that we can use conversational AI to manage brand reputation, right? To kind of get ahead of that. So do you guys have any thoughts about that? About how, like, what is conversational AI's potential role as an assistant or as a helper with, or even an accelerator for reputational issues?
Well, so some of the things is it goes back to that intentional discussion. And even as you were talking about, let's say we have a crisis, you have now suddenly an ability to have something that can start to field or start, quite frankly, it's that qualifying of either the lead or the qualifying of what they're talking to or what information needs to get out there. It's coming from, if you have crafted your voice correctly, if you've crafted the conversation correctly, what will happen is then they will get a warm brand embodying interaction and engagement. Now, the biggest thing to remember is, number one, if you have to go to a human, that's not a fail. That's simply a situation of where we make sure that you do it smoothly and say, oh, I'm sorry, this is something out of my world. And that is why we often will say, you're talking to an agent, you're talking to a virtual agent, because it then sets expectations.
Yeah.
What's interesting to me always is there is the age-old argument of, I want to talk to the operator. I want to talk to the human.
Yeah.
A human can't change the policy anymore. And actually, as we just were laughing about the Air Canada example, sometimes they get creative. And that's where you have to think about those. That's where testing is important. I'm not going to lie. Every time I see create a bot in 20 minutes, a little part of me dies. Because fast, good, and cheap, you've got fast and cheap happening. Guess what? You're missing. You are missing some really important parts to how that needs to be monitored. Ethan Mullick talks about the human in the loop.
Yep.
There always needs to be a human in the loop. But what you're actually able to do is you're able to scale that message. You're able to make sure that they're out there and they're covering it. Also, you're covering all your channels, because people aren't always going to call. They're not always even going to hit your website and hit your chat bot. They're going to go to your social bot. They're going to go to your Twitter feed. They're going to go, I'm sorry, X feed. Sorry, Elon.
I call it Twixter.
Die.
Just.
I like that. Oh, I like that.
Just be safe.
Yeah. Left Twix, right Twix. Ooh. They're going to go to all these other channels.
Yep.
They might even go and store to your kiosk. These are places where you can deploy that because you've already got your system set up, where you're going to get that consistent answer, and that can help field it so that you're on point. You're able to get ahead of that. So if it's, I heard someone's going to kneel at the Philadelphia Eagles game, back when that was a big deal. I actually remember dealing with this as a corporate example. Oh, shoot, they're one of our partners. What do we have? What's our statement? Well, I'm going to make sure that that statement's available in multiple places, and we can talk about it. And I've also got a point of where I have a strategy, because I know my PR specialist has already coached someone. Yeah. Imagine if when you're coaching someone to be a speaker, they actually do it, because they aren't going to be like, oh, I got nervous and then I messed it up. You're actually able to have a little more control. So some of our pharma clients are always like, oh, wait a minute. Compliance is going to adore that we can control some of that. And depending on how we're using LLMs and generative AI, we're able to be a little more on script than a human would.
Yep.
And that's kind of the thing where I laugh and say, when folks are saying, oh, I want the human. Humans don't change those policies. Humans sometimes aren't even better. Even when we look at like sentiment analysis, humans are only right about between 85 and 90% of the time of interpreting someone's mood. So when someone's like, well, is it 100%? Well, no, but no one is.
Right.
And that doesn't say that, it doesn't have to be perfect, but it's our way of also saying our benchmark is a little different. Of perfection isn't always it. That's what makes us human. That's also what makes things authentic. It's just, what is that tolerance of, I'll allow you to stammer or mispronounce something. I'm not going to allow you to create a whole new policy.
Yeah.
So that's where the testing and the looking through the use case and constant monitoring with conversational AI. And I feel like all AI is this now, and everyone's kind of starting to accept that launch does not mean done.
Right.
It's just your starting point. And now we're moving into a different way of dealing with it. We've been planning it so that we've got our basics and our foundations. Now we're going to start to explore and see what else it can do.
Like the big part of this is not to replace existing tactics. It's in addition to. It's just another tool in your toolbox.
It's additive.
So for instance, back during COVID, we worked with McDonald's UK and we actually added in a lot of PR/crisis information to an Alexa skill because it's, what are your now crisis hours? What's the menu? What are your cleaning policies? Like all those types of things that people were asking. We looked at how do we do it in a conversational way. And then, as a secondary piece, here's a way you can make your orders and then working with Amazon to actually facilitate all that stuff. But that actually started out almost as a exclusively PR approach to address that very real need that they had to try to get that information out as many places as possible. So there's also ways you can use it in existing tactics as, again, like mobile app as a layer on top, but you can add PR content, you can add brand promotional content. It doesn't have to be my PR stuff's over here, my brand stuff's over here. It can actually live in the same place. And then when people ask for it, it's just delivered.
Yeah. It is about access ultimately, right? I mean, it's about being able to get the information in the way you want, when you want it.
Yep.
And we're being spoiled or conditioned, I think, as this generation or this multitude of generations, as we deal with AI, that's what's going to continue to happen. I don't know. I think it's the more I'm talking to you, the more I'm sort of now those dots are starting to connect even brighter. You were just talking about how it won't veer off of if you prepare your AI, your conversational AI with statements, it won't veer off the messaging.
Right.
I could just I've taken executives through media training for hours and hours.
Yeah.
And some of them are wonderful and some of them are need improvement.
Sure.
And some people get it immediately and some people have a natural talent for bridging or for pivoting or, whatever in a non-shifty way. I could upload a media training deck right now, and then it will be media trained, like the whatever instance of AI I'm using. And it won't veer off of that. It'll stick to the rules until it doesn't, I suppose. You have to keep watching.
And that's where, like, with all of these things, and that's one of the big things of, I was actually at a conference, the Voice and AI conference in October, and was sitting, I love going to the way more technical stuff because strategy is really fun, but hearing the technical piece of talking through like tolerances of what am I willing to accept? That's what we figure out before we start building, or we should. How about that? We should. And then you can use those RAG systems to test and make sure that what's coming out is right. And then determining, can I live with if it puts this word here, or if it's that, or these, hallucinations of this level, okay. Or if not, because, hey, this is life or death, this is healthcare information, then no, then we're going to go to a much more rigid structure. And that's the way life is.
Yeah.
You have to think of just those tolerances, then give you your guidance of how much generative AI can I use? And that's okay because not everything is generative AI. I know that's probably blasphemy to some folks, but
yeah, I would think that if any company and this means most companies, I suppose, that has a customer base and has a customer service function, whether it's a call center or just your salespeople or your marketers just answering the phone, whoever it is, that customer service function. I think that if we only ever get to the point where somebody calls in and you don't have to listen to 7 recordings and you don't have to wait.
Yep.
Yeah.
Right. That's a major thing. That's why every time I call my health insurance or my specialty pharmacy or whatever it is, the very first thing I say is representative.
Yeah.
Always.
Because you don't want to navigate the structure. You
don't
want to do the navigation.
I don't have that much time.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, and chances are you went to the website, you couldn't find it. So you're like, fine, I'll call. And so I always love hey, did you know you could go to our website? That's why I'm here.
Right.
And And some of that, I mean, like we could pick on customer service phone trees all day. The other part of it too, though, are like little interesting things from a B2B perspective of, let's say that person who is doing the media training and it is a human, but let's say I have media notes, there's certain approved stats that I'm allowed to use. Instead of having to go look and read that form, if I have an assistant set up internally where I can say, what is our latest, how many billion hamburgers have been served? What's our current line? That helps the PR team instead of having to constantly go, is it hidden in SharePoint somewhere?
Right.
Yeah.
Is it how we phrase that? Can I just ask it questions? Like that's something we're actually playing with right now is looking at research, a collection of trend reports. And I just can ask it questions of like, hey, is this trending down? And then what it's doing is it's comparing all of those reports and that data. So that way, then I'm getting that piece from there instead of having to go through and sift it myself.
Oh, yeah.
And we're testing, and those are things internally of like, no, you can't say that. Yes, but you can say this.
Right.
Or what is the correct spelling? These are, when I think of the bane of my existence of, no, it's not called this. It's called, you flip the words. Those seem like little simple things. Or what is our policy on this? Or how do we handle that? Or again, what are those things? We can actually put that information in a conversational way of just asking instead of having to take the moment to type it. Now, by the way, conversational does include typing because there's sometimes is information you don't want spoken.
Yep.
Right.
Because I just want to look at it on my screen. Like I just asked about test results. I don't know if I want everyone in this train car to know that I actually just tested positive for COVID while I'm trying to get to the next stop. Things like that, or personal information.
Yeah.
Like bank balances, financial services is a whole other realm of confidential information. So you have to balance that.
Yeah, I would imagine that, and if you sort of extrapolate that to, what a day-to-day marketer or communicator might be facing, in their job, and you're using different tools to get different things done. Everybody talks about how the holy grail is measurement, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah.
That's not something you want to talk. You don't want somebody to say. You don't want to have a voice conversation where your conversation partner is saying, and then it travels at a 45-degree upward on the x-axis until it reaches point. That doesn't work.
Yeah.
So there has to be a multimodal kind of aspect to everything.
Yeah, it could be voice input and it comes back on the screen. It
Yeah.
could be like in certain cases, especially like in the car where you can't physically look at a screen, you get a voice coming back. There's different, depending on the situation, there's different ways we can handle it. But
you can even this is going to sound so Neanderthal, but you can just do something like, I don't know, send a link to the graphic that you need to look at when you're at a point where you can look at it. I know that sounds crazy and very simple, but those are some of the simple things. If I've asked you to prepare this report for me, can I see this visual? Then when I'm where I need to be, you can do that, especially if we're asking it to do Agentic. Can you give me a report that gives me X, Y, Z?
Ooh, you just said,
go find that
you said the
information
magic
out
word.
and then send it to me.
You said
the latest buzzword.
I don't know whether I should have like an air horn.
I know.
mentioned
It's all right.
Agentic.
Yeah.
It's because this seems. I think there's a world in which, and maybe it's the world we live in which your average person who is dealing with all these tools might think that conversational AI is agentic AI, and because in many ways it is kind of miraculous.
It kind of can be.
It can be.
It can be, of course, and it will get there. But I feel like it's definitely a built for multimodal or multi-task actions. I just did this great thing. My friend Frank Prendergast, shout out to Frank, has been really going overboard, or I should say, the extra mile with custom GPTs. And with the addition of voice, it does open up a couple of different possibilities. So he's developed this kind of series of GPTs that helps you build your website copy, for example. And it's broken down into several, like when agents come in, you just talk to the agent, say, build me a website, and But this is, in this case, the first part of it, he's set it up as an interview. So the custom GPT, you have to go into voice mode. The custom GPT will ask you questions, and you just talk. right?
Yeah.
You talk. And then the output is not a conversation. Like after this is all done, the output is a document that takes everything you've said, but puts it into like proper terminology and into something that makes sense. Cause I talk all over the place. And, I think even doing that with Frank's GPT there was maybe the biggest thing that got me over the hurdle of accepting and embracing voice as a mode, because I'm like, oh, I can talk all over the place and it still gets it.
Yeah.
It's like, it's a miracle.
Well, she's the double English major. I was always the picture guy. I mean, I was a visual designer for years. So like, I'm not a writer, but I've written 2 books. Well, guess what? We actually ended up speaking the book into existence. So we had a loose outline for what we wanted to talk about. And this was all pre-ChatGPT, because had we had ChatGPT, it would have been even easier. Mm-hmm. But literally talking into it in existence, getting the transcripts, and then doing editorial and kind of moving things around really helped my process, because like I can talk with the best of them, but when I'm sitting at a blank or looking at a blank screen, it's very intimidating for me to start writing.
Yeah.
So like it was a natural way for me to just talk it out. We do presentations all the time and everything else. So it was like no big deal. But that was like the first aha. And then we're like, well, we just used voice to write a book about voice. Like how
how
meta was that? So, but yeah, I mean, it's definitely one of those things where once you get over that hurdle and you start interacting with these systems, especially as you start to see success, that's really where the magic happens.
Yeah. And there is something about speaking things out into existence. When you say it, Bruce Lee talked about those being spells. Mm-hmm. It's the same thing of when you're talking those things out. So we have to get used to and comfortable hearing our voices and talking to ourselves a little bit more than we used to, you know. It's probably, I mean, I don't know anyone who adores the sound of their own voice, even though I've been in meetings with people I swear to. But that whole idea of kind of getting past that, but then getting comfortable, it is a lot easier for helping folks who, again, from reading or getting that access, like you said, it's information access and distribution. There's a lot of things in AI that ultimately, and it's because of my content background, it's a content thing. Yeah. It's not, it's technology enabling content as opposed to, and I think that's kind of one of the things to think through of, what am I trying to do with this AI or these things? Because there's a lot of really fun novelty things, but when we really start cooking, I feel like with peanut oil, it's definitely involving thinking about that content accessibility. How am I giving that information? And yes, how I parse it when I'm talking to someone will be different than how, if they're reading it, than if they're reading it on a chatbot, then what have you. That is definitely where the art and the design comes in. Mm-hmm. Just as we would never put a brochure on a website, same thing.
Anymore.
We have to think about those nuances.
Yeah. We used to
anymore.
Do that. You know, I remember 2003. Does anybody else?
Yeah.
It's interesting. There's a couple things there that I'd love to pick apart, or not pick apart, because that makes it sound like I've got a critique.
We're used to that.
No, it's more about like I want to pull it up and just understand more. But you mentioned the magic word, and I feel like, as we start to kind of wind down here, I would like to get into where you see all this going, and especially with agents. So agentic AI, it's not something I know. I mean, I know as much about it as, any dabbler in AI who's like, all right, I just can't wait for, well, I'm not exactly feeling great and easy about agents coming along, but I know they're coming. So, hey, I'm all in. So now I'm like, all right, fine. Let me have the thing that I just kind of just speak into my phone or just type a sentence, whatever it is. I give one input, says, look, I need to publish my podcast. Go grab the files, put them in here, do this, get that, make this happen, do the corrections and give me the drafts. Like, done. That's because I'm going to have to do that now with AI. Of course, that's so much less time than it used to be, but
sure.
Taking that 3 hours down to 30 minutes is very attractive to me.
But what if you could take it down to about 3 minutes?
Even better.
And I think that's where the agents really come in. So everyone talks about agents like they're this far off thing, but I've been working with agents for the past year.
Yeah.
I won't mention the platform, but there's a platform that's built that you can use Claude, OpenAI, different language models, Perplexity. And effectively what you do is you create individual virtual employees almost, or AI employees, and you give them, like I give mine specific personalities. So I've got one that does use cases, one that does web research for me, whatever. And then you basically just give it a series of steps. So if you have SOPs already established for how you do something, especially like when you're talking about the podcast, you could literally give those instructions to this assistant and literally give it the input, and it'll then do its job and then hand it off to the next one. So maybe you've got one that, takes the transcript and creates the show notes. And then you got one that actually will go through and upload the files and like whatever the different things are. Like those are all things you can actually do and start to stitch some things together. So is it true agentic? Not yet, but we're close enough where you can almost fake it and see a lot of those efficiencies. Right now. And so like there are platforms that exist. And if anyone wants more information about it, reach out to me and I'm happy to talk about it. But the idea being that you can actually start to take advantage of it now and start to see a lot of benefit in your own work. I mean, I've deployed at this point probably 50 different agents that are doing various things from editorial to research to outreach. I mean, there's all kinds of things that I'm doing. But I started small. I saw some success with it. I went, oh, what else can I do with it? And just kind of looked at adding features. So I wasn't trying to boil the ocean all at once. It was literally like, let's triage our email. Let's start there and see how that works. Oh, that worked pretty well. Now let me see what else I can do.
Yeah.
I think the other thing that we're seeing is right now, and this was a conversation we had earlier today, is there's two things. One, the value of our work, the value of content. And basically the value of brand are going to change. There's an analogy of like when I moved from that agency of 4 to, which wasn't 4 when I left, but then to an agency of 977 people, suddenly a bunch of the hats I used to have to wear because I was in a small organization went away. And I had this freak out of imposter syndrome of, holy hell, what is my job again? Am I over my head? Wait, I'm supposed to focus on these things. And then, of course, I got over it and I realized, no, I can dive this much deeper into the things that were the talent and things I wanted to bring to my role. That is what's going to happen as well as like from an agency and B2B perspective. Yeah, we're not going to bill by how many hours it takes us to do something. We're going to bill by like more of that old adage of the story of the, the submarine and the guy comes up and shows up with a wrench and in 2 minutes, figures it out, tightens this one screw, and he says, that'll be $200,000. Well, it only took you 2 minutes. Yeah, but it took me 20 years to learn. That's the screw to mess with. That's where that value is going to come in. And we can't discount that as from our humanity perspective. Truly human things. But the other side with agents that I think is understanding, do I really need to launch something to space to answer a question? Like, yes, it's super cool to have super intelligence, but I don't need super intelligence to do some of the things I need to do. And as a matter of fact, super intelligence might actually be a challenge if I'm trying to keep them on script. If I'm trying to tell it, don't optimize this. You have to say these words. That I'm able to use these things within the potential of what it is, as opposed to having the Formula One Ferrari that I can never drive down Lakeshore Drive because A, it's not fit for it, and B, I can only go 40 miles an hour. Those are the things that I think we're going to see in the future. The other thing too is this big gap though between knowing when to use those things and familiarity of business to understand, okay, I don't have to build it, but how do I use it? And I think that's something like we laughingly said today, oh my gosh, it's another 7 years of this, we were teaching people all about voice and how to use it and the education and kind of the evangelism. We're now looking at that of how we use AI and evangelism as well of here's how I can help you so that you're feeling comfortable. Here's how to do the start small and test. And it's not start small because it's stupid and small. That's only the amount of impact I need today to convince me to continue building. And that's okay because then that's something I can do in 3 months as opposed to 18 months launching a giant thing.
It's so important to just keep, I think that's a great way to think about it. And, I have been having discussions about, okay, great, we're going to have super intelligence or we'll have agents, but at the end of the process or whatever they produce, they still have to be managed, and you still have to have somebody to look at what it's creating.
Yep.
If it's on the creator side, like if you're putting agents in charge of running our power grid, hey, that's out of my pay range. I don't know how to do that, but I would hope that there's humans watching. I really would.
Yeah.
But then, like there's then we're all using all kinds of algorithms to optimize different parts of our infrastructure, and that's fine. But I just, I struggle a little bit with the idea that, once we have super intelligence, then we can all sit back and, it'll just take care of it. I simply don't think that's true. I feel like, the advent of more knowledge at our fingertips has been the story for all of humanity.
Yep.
We were hunter-gatherers. Suddenly somebody figured out how to pick up a piece of bone with a little bit of meat on it, and just like, I can put this, use this and draw something on the wall. Maybe not with meat, but I'm talking about this plant has a particular color. It looks good on the wall. Goodness gracious, I can put the whole story of our travel here. So suddenly knowledge grows. So then you get to the Library of Alexandria. Everybody's got this knowledge. The printing press happens. Everybody's got more knowledge now. I mean, it didn't happen as immediately and in as accelerated a way as it's happening now. But in every single instance, not everybody did that. Like, you get to the point, I think as people, we all have this place, this limited point where we get to, and we're like, okay, that's enough knowledge. I'm fine. I don't need any more knowledge.
Yeah.
And I think it's just like you said, it's like, okay, I have this super intelligence to do things. Will I really need it to do all these things? Like I've got things that I can get this far, and I don't need the rest of this stuff.
Well, in practical business, you probably don't. You probably don't need AGI, quite frankly. A lot of what we're talking about is automating basic business processes, whether you're using AI or other tools. But at the end of the day, it's trying to be more efficient with the time that you have and not spending time on very time-intensive manual processes. That's, one of the components. So that would be the internal efficiency story. Or are you trying to increase sales, or are you trying to find new business? Like, what are your objectives? And kind of start there and look at how can technology in general, it doesn't have to be AI, but how does that help enable that or solve some of those issues?
Yeah.
But I'm not convinced that we need AGI or supercomputing or super intelligence for business. Now, there are going to be a lot of things, in the physics realm and in the chemistry realm, things like that.
Yep.
Urban planning. That's where a lot of that stuff's going to start to benefit. But the big challenge that I see is there's a lot of noise in the AI space about AGI and superintelligence, and it's almost paralyzed the business space because there's plenty of things they can do right now to get started, start to experiment, have some of those learnings, have some of the successes. But because we keep churning out, today there were 4 more models released, and then tomorrow there's going to be another 7, and then there's this robot coming. Like, it's like this never-ending funnel of stuff. But part of what we do is help people filter out what's relevant to them versus what's just kind of general noise or cool stuff, sci-fi stuff, but might not be directly related to your business.
Or let's be honest, some of the demos we see that are demos are very Wizard of Oz demos of like, it'll behave like this, but actually before you even get to touch this, it's going to be 12 months because we got this one POC running. And that's okay because we need that work and we need to see where we're going. But there's stuff we can do in the here and now that honestly is not rocket science anymore. And that's okay because that's awesome because it's familiar, it's controllable, and it'll actually help us build our comfort zone so that when the big stuff's scalable and doable, we'll actually have a comfort zone as opposed to, I can't imagine anyone who's jumping into the space right now. Like my hat's off to you because I feel like we've had all this time to kind of look at things and filter it. And it was not the breakneck speed.
No.
And as of yesterday's presidential announcement, it's going to get even worse we've got, while he's talking about Stargate, a whole nother model released from a completely different, not OpenAI, with DeepSeek. And it's like, oh, crap. All right. Well, now I got to know all about DeepSeek or something about it. And that's kind of also where we try to offer ourselves up of, you're already trying to run a business.
Yeah. Let us figure all these other things out.
Let us figure this out. We promise and hand on our heart, we're doing this for good, but it's also that's actually bring in those folks. So that way, then you don't have to some degree and that's because there's so much volume coming through of what makes sense and what applies to your business today, as opposed to that's freaking cool and amazing. I have no idea how I'm going to apply it, but freaking keep at it. You've got the funding. Thank you.
I'll tell you, I can't think of a better way even to sort of, to wrap that up than just to say, listen, you don't need everything, right? We have people like us crazy nutcases out here who are looking at everything for you. Yeah. And even I don't look at everything for sure. Like, I'm just like, okay, this is not really right. I can't deal with this right now. I'm just going to focus on these 44 different things. I don't need 73.
Right.
And just focus on what you can focus on to make those incremental changes. Look, as we kind of wrap this up for real, any last words, guys? Is there any final last little bit of wisdom that you'd like to drop on the crowd here?
I mean, I feel like the biggest thing I can say is do what you did. Just get started. Now, whether it's learning or experimenting or use case identification, like just start. There is so much fear out there. There's so much, quite frankly, misinformation related to AI. And it's just a matter of getting in there, getting comfortable, getting those quick wins, seeing how it can actually help your process. I'm also a big proponent of like shortcutting process by knowing how to do it manually and then going, oh, I wonder if I could try this little bit right here. Get those wins under your belt, get comfortable with it. It's not scary, but unless you start, you're never going to know.
Yeah.
Yep. Susan, anything to add to that?
I mean, I would also say there's a lot of urgency about if you don't start now, your competitor is going to steal everything. It's going to steal your job. That's really not the way to think about it. That's just going to terrify yourself. It's also going to keep you up at night.
Right.
We've got plenty of other things about AI to keep us up at night. My advice is to start thinking about, and are you ready? But also look at what you've got now. Don't treat it like this precious, fragile skunk work that can never touch anything else. If you don't make it part of your channels or part of how else you're doing things, it's always going to feel like this otherness. And it needs to, if you're going to be putting yourself out there as a comms team and you need to be cohesive, you have to, because if you don't have an AI policy and you push it out and you don't let people touch it, that people are going to use it because they will, because curious nature is your best star. And then you're going to lose out on all that information. You're going to lose out on their wins, their losses, and they're not going to socialize it. So it's still going to be, we're still at a time where it's very much at the individual and business team level. Enterprises are doing it, but it's not necessarily scaled. Yeah. This is the time to start kind of getting your collective team together and looking at it from that perspective.
You're preaching the gospel. And that is exactly what I like to hear and what I will be telling people moving forward. Susan and Scot Westwater, I really appreciate your time. Thank you so much for coming. If anybody is interested in learning more about Susan and Scot and about Pragmatic Digital, go to pragmatic.digital on the web. Check them out. Their bios are there. You can find out as much information as you'd like to on there. But if that's not enough, go to LinkedIn. Find Susan and Scot with one T. Westwater. It's very simple, and it will be spelled properly in the episode title. You can also find Susan on Twixter at SJW75. Don't read into that, folks. SJW75 on Twixter. And then, on the conference circuit, we'll see them speak here and there a lot. And I highly urge any of you who are hitting any of the big, like SEM related or social media marketing stuff or what's the one we go to? CEX or Maycon, any of these big conferences in our world, just look out for Susan and Scot because I'm sure you'll find them. So thank you both so much for coming.
Sure. And then one last thing is if you do locally Chicago, we do head up a meetup called AI and Chai. Thank you, Paul and Kathy, for letting us steal AI and CLE and making an AI and Chai. And that also is a quarterly place where we're going to be getting together with some information to help folks understand how do you bring AI to your organization.
Awesome. Oh, one last thing I should have said. I said, buy the book, guys. Everybody out there.
Yeah.
Voice marketing, harnessing the power of conversational AI to drive customer engagement. Go to Amazon. The link will be in the show notes. And thank you all very much. Thanks, guys. Thank you for joining us.
Yeah, thank you.
Thanks for taking the time to listen in on today's conversation. If you enjoyed it, please be sure to subscribe through the podcast player of your choice, share with your friends and colleagues, and leave me a review. 5 stars would be preferred, but it's up to you. Do you have ideas for future guests or you want to be on the show? Let me know at dan@trendingcommunicator.com. Thanks again for listening to the Trending Communicator.